We will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here in what we know is an extremely busy time of the year. I think this is going to be an awesome time to take a breath together as a community. Super honored to have these folks in the space today for the C plus B community talk in partnership with Heritage Months, a much needed call to action from the Native American community at DU. So C plus B is, again, super excited, super honored to have these panelists moderate this conversation today. Um, I am going to hand it over to Charlie, who is going to be the moderator today. Live transcript is available. If you click it down on the right-hand side, if you need that. And if you need anything else as far as the webinar, please feel free to message me directly. And with that, I will hand it over to Charlie.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. As you know, so my name is Charlie Amaya Scott. My English pronouns are they, them, she, hers. I am a third year PhD student studying higher education and currently attend this lovely university with all of you. Before I begin, I also want to start an land acknowledgement. And for those who do not know, or for those who are familiar with land acknowledgements, they're sort of formalized statements to really sort of understand the role that universities occupy within settler colonialism. Yet for us as indigenous peoples, land acknowledgements are really sort of involved with understanding the relationships that we have to land and place. And so, particularly with this land acknowledgement, I want to acknowledge that we, all of us who currently attend the University of Denver, are occupying and contributing to the colonization of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute homelands, who had a distinct and unique relationship to this place long before any of us here. In addition, I also want to recognize that Denver, Colorado, as what's known as, was also a place in which a lot of Native Indigenous peoples across the U.S. empire were sort of forced and asked to relocate due to the Indian Relocation Act. And so this Denver Native community has a very particular history to colonization, considering that like a lot of these communities have come from distant places. In addition, Denver, Colorado also hosted a conference in which Richard Henry Pratt, who was the founder of Carla Indian School, actually came here and sort of shared his vision of kill the Indian, save the man. And so Denver is a very unique place in its sort of history of colonization of Native Indigenous peoples. Not to mention when we learn more about the Evans Report and the sort of culpability of the founder of both the University of Denver and also of Denver in itself, we also see that there's this very sort of intimate connection that the university has with displacing, removing, and eliminating Indigenous peoples, particularly its role in the Sand Creek Massacre. And so, as Indigenous scholars, as panelists, it's important that we understand these histories and also share these histories because it is our responsibility to share them in ways that sort of reminds people that we are still here and will continue to be here. Thank you. So now I have the honor to introduce each of these lovely panelists. The first person I'm introducing is Jaylee Ren Counter, who is an enrolled citizen member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, currently a third year undergraduate student who is studying biology and psychology and a minor in chemistry. She hopes to attend medical school and become a physician. I'm excited for that for her. She also is a powwow dancer and enjoys sort of different cultural representations of that, however it manifests. I mean, one I think particular example is the lovely earrings that Jaylee is wearing right now. The other person on this panel is Panaquisat Valdez, who is a Southern Ute and also a descendant of the Hamish, the Zuni, and the Chris Pueblo. He is also a descendant of a freed slave named John Taylor, who was a Buffalo soldier and also who served as an interpreter for the Utes. Panaquisa is also a graduate student within, I believe, the International Studies in the Cobell School, and is a recipient of one of their distinguished fellowships as well. And then lastly, we have Dr. Angela Parker, who's an assistant professor of history within the university. She is Madan in Hidatsa from the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota and Cree from the Rocky Boy Reservation in Montana. A lot of her scholarship and research focuses on 20th century Native history, particularly the genealogy of tribal sovereignty claims, oil extraction, and activism within Indigenous communities. She also does a lot of research and scholarship around photography, both the history and also current representation of Native Indigenous peoples within the US Empire. And so I'm honored to be able to moderate this panel and share space with these three amazing folks because we are here to talk about what exactly is a call to actions or various call to actions that the University of Denver can do to both support and celebrate Native Indigenous peoples, especially during Native Heritage Month. And so the first question that I have for each of the panelists, starting with Jaylee, hopefully, and then going on to Panekosut, is understanding. So each of you, as I have introduced you, have a unique experience here at the University of Denver. I mean, one of you is literally studying biology as an undergrad. Another person is a graduate student studying international studies. And then we have a professor in history. So clearly each of you are occupying different spaces within the University of Denver. And I was wondering if you could share with me what has been the most memorable moments since your time here.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for having me today. I'm super honored to be able to speak. So personally, I believe that my time here has been shaped with so much diversity and experiences, and I believe that importantly, it's important to have those experiences that surround my culture and who I am as well. So for me personally, the best experience for me so far has actually occurred 2 weeks ago. We had some students as well as like some of our members from the community come and just kind of like surround this space. And we were able to share parts of our culture like song and dance. We had some panelists who were able to share their experiences here at DU so far. So I think ultimately that was just so beautiful to witness because it shows that despite this institution being created to serve folks not like us, but we're still able to occupy these spaces and being able to be together and share our culture and aspects of that was so beautiful personally.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you started off on a positive note because I think I'm gonna go negative. But one of my friends, a great professor here named Oliver Kaplan, I was talking to them one of the first weeks, and he basically told me that I was one of two Indigenous students that he had ever met at Corbell, which is really sad, honestly, especially because Indigenous people have such an interesting outlook on international affairs and global affairs in general. So I think that's been the most memorable moment for me because I think I really want to work on getting more Indigenous people into the international school because it's such an important perspective to have. So yeah, that's my most memorable moment so far.
For me, it actually also happened this year. I helped to bring 4 Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho singers to campus to share the White Antelope song, which was the song that Cheyenne leader White Antelope sang as basically the soldiers were descending upon the Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek. And I was only able to make that connection because of one of the former like student services director, Vicki Eagle, had made that connection. And also Anna Motti in the Museum of Anthropology has built a really strong relationship with descendant communities of historic tribes. And so between the two of them, I was able to make a connection with George Levi, who is one of the leaders within one of the military societies for the Southern Cheyenne. And he sort of corralled some of his community members who are like really talented singers to come to campus to be able to share that song, you know, sort of broadly with campus, but also with my classes. And for me, it was a really amazing experience. Like there was one point in the class where when they were visiting like my specific class, my freshman seminar, and they sang the song a cappella, and I'd been sort of like, you know, immersed in the story of the song for a couple days at that point. And I almost started like ugly crying in my classroom just because it hit me like all of a sudden. And I think as a historian, I'm kind of like, I like to think of myself as super tough, right? Like, oh yeah, that's just what happened. Yep, that was really gross. Those people are like psychopaths, you know, let's keep going and hold them accountable, you know. And that was the first time where I had sort of allowed myself to actually be more vulnerable, like in a classroom space. So it was kind of embarrassing, but it was also really, I think, important, because part of why we study these things and why they are important is because it's not because of colonialism, right? Like it's not because of like these larger structures, it's because of our human connections and our ability to have empathy, you know, for other community members, for people outside our community, that type of thing. And so for me, that was really important. It also highlighted for me the need to have a more consistent like funding structure associated with all of these curricular, you know, events, or like the event that Jaylee was talking about, which I heard about after it happened. By the way, NSA, let the professors know what's going on. But the fact that, you know, as a faculty member, much less as students, that we're being required to sort of like scrape together funding. And like, I literally went to probably about 20 entities at DU to ask for funding for these singers to come. And I think for me, how amazing and beautiful would it be if we had a more consistent funding structure, not only for sort of like the student support and events part, because I feel like all of those are also co-curricular activities, but also for, you know, professors that want to step outside of the box and bring in these amazing community members who have devoted their lives to studying and learning and preserving and passing on like traditional knowledge, culture, language, music, art, etc. So for me, I think like one of the biggest calls for action is like for DU to sort of step up so that we can have these sort of life-changing, important experiences and not feel like we're going with our hat in hand to like 20 different places begging for money.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Parker, for bringing up that particular issue, because I think all of you, again, all of you are bringing up these very sort of, yes, they're memorable, but they're memorable because they're transformative. I mean, Jaylee, you talked about the way that you were sort of with community and how you were able to celebrate with community. But Panequasa, on the other hand, you talked about how, like, you know that there's this community of Native Indigenous peoples that exists, and you're sort of surprised that a friend of yours would mention that they've only met 2 people at Corbell. Whereas Dr. Parker, you're talking about how you intentionally were creating community. And but the thing is though, I think something that is sort of intriguing about this entire thing is the issue of financial support. Which you did sort of highlight, because that definitely is, I think, a lot of issues. But the thing is though, it's not always just about money. It's really like these opportunities to meet Native Indigenous peoples, to invite Native Indigenous peoples, to celebrate them, and also build these sort of meaningful and personal connections. Because we know that our community is amazing, and we just want to share our brilliance with a lot of people. But for some odd reason, there's always these obstacles in the way. And speaking of these obstacles, I was wondering if each of you could share your experiences of being Native or Indigenous at the University of Denver. And if you could touch upon things that you wish should have happened or things that should have changed just a little bit to make it either a better experience or something that you sort of are desiring.
So I think for me, it has been really difficult to try to navigate my college experience. There seems to be a tendency, for our communities. They really give us so much support to get to college, and they guide us to the journey, and then like we get here and it's like we're faced with so much culture shock and imposter syndrome, and like having to combat those along with like our academics can be really challenging as well. So I think like personally, I think it would be beneficial to, I guess, incorporate more transitions, like to help us transition better into our college experience, as opposed to just like coming here super shocked and like just being on our own, trying to navigate all of these things together. So.
Yeah, I think going off of that, a huge obstacle for me in a lot of these spaces, and I'm in like the economic space as well, which is its own kind of whole thing. Not having any representation in anything at all is like really difficult, right? So like in a lot of the grad classes, I don't read anything about Indigenous people, even though they are a very important part of the global system, right? And so like that is harmful, I think, because it seems to me that it's like this huge erasure of like all the work that we've done and continue to do as Indigenous people. So yeah.
I think for me, one of the biggest obstacles is just consistently feeling torn between these different areas that faculty have to excel in or want to excel in. So, I was just talking about it with a student that came into my office hours, and like he's non-native, and so we're kind of just talking more broadly about what was going on campus. And I was like, when I have to be very clear about my priorities, because there's just limited time, right, in the day. And so in order to like get tenure, I have to write, I have to do my research, I have to be present and make an intellectual contribution, right, not just to the college but sort of more generally. And then on the daily grind, there's like teaching responsibilities. And then, sort of my third priority is making sure that this is a good environment for our Native students and for my colleagues, like other Native faculty and staff, right? And then anything beyond that, including email, sometimes just like, I'm just like, I just don't have emotional energy for this right now, because I also have a family. I have like a 9-year-old kid, right? And I constantly feel like I'm not doing enough in any of those areas. So there's this real feeling of like, time is finite, it's limited, there's so much work to do. And I don't ever feel like I'm writing enough. I don't ever feel like my classes are, as well developed as they could be, or that I'm getting my grading done on time. And I never feel like I'm providing enough support to like Native students on campus. And I just want to give a shout out here to Chris Nelson, who I think is like an example of a faculty member who's just doing an amazing amount of support in addition to having a really ambitious and productive research agenda. So kudos to her, and hopefully I'll be there at some point. But at this point, it just feels like there's just not enough time. In addition to that, I would say there are sort of like these microaggressions or maybe just aggressions, right, that I'm sure students experience like on a daily basis, and faculty members are not immune to that. So for example, for the FSEM that I'm teaching, which focuses on Sand Creek and sort of its legacy at DU, and FSEM is like a freshman seminar for those of you that don't know. So it's all freshmen. to be able to get funding for a trip to Sand Creek, to the actual place where this massacre happened, and which is really pivotal in terms of our institutional history here at DU. I had sort of like this 2-month, sort of, low-key email battle, or not email battle, but just sort of like a back and forth about where can I find funding for this with the freshman seminar program. And it really wasn't until I sort of called people, in, I guess, in a faculty meeting of FSEM advisors or FSEM professors, and I said, this is really important. Like, we have to do this. And, it's going to cost about $2,000. I kind of like went through it. And it was at that point, and this is like the heartening part, other faculty said, I'm staying on campus. You can have my funding for my freshman trip. And there were like 20 people in the room that said, you can have my funding. This is really important. We want to support this, right? And that's when the FSEM program finally said, we will fund the entire bus and, like food for the trip, right? And that's great. And I'm so thankful for that funding. And I'm so glad that it happened. I just feel like I shouldn't have had to essentially be the squeaky wheel amongst, my fellow faculty in order to get it funded. And then within that meeting, there was a staff member who I think is super well-intentioned, very kind in general, but their message was, well, these are all high impact practices, whether it's going to get pizza or whether it's going to Sand Creek, they're all high impact practices. And I was like, they might all fall under the definition of what you're using as high impact practices. However, one of those practices specifically has to do with equity and dealing with sort of our historical responsibility, as an institution. So I'm not saying it's higher impact. However, I do feel like this is something that we need to commit funds to and to support, right? And that's sort of like an example of one of those little microaggressions that happen, like saying, they're all good people. There's fine people on both sides. These are all high impact practices. It's sort of like this soft, false equivalency of like US liberalism that says these are all the same. And it's like, no, let's sit down and like talk and think about this a little bit more. And I think that's just one example. And I know like other faculty members, other staff members have experienced really similar dynamics. So it's not just this one person, it's not just this one program. This is sort of across the board. I really, if I could have an ask for any staff or faculty members that might be, watching this panel right now, it's to think before you say no. Think before you sort of make this equivalency. Think before you say, we've never done it that way before. And think about instead, what are the possibilities of what we can do as an institution and what we can support.
Okay, I don't know if folks can hear me right now, but I'm experiencing some really awkward technical difficulties. Not exactly sure why. But if you can hear me, great. If you can't, you're just hearing me smile at the camera. But going back to recentering the panel, a lot of you are sort of, first, thank you so much for being honest and your vulnerability around the experiences that you are having at the University of Denver. In a lot of ways, each of you are speaking to different dimensions of the issues that you're experiencing being Native at the University of Denver. But the funny thing is that they all sort of coincide. It really gets to the crux of understanding what exactly does support look like for Native Indigenous peoples. And I think each of you are asking different aspects of support which can show up differently. And so that really problematizes what we mean by support. I mean, Jaylee, you talked about how like you wish that there was like this sort of transitional program to really sort of like accommodate and get you to acclimate to the university environment. Whereas Panukwasa, you're talking about the integration of indigenous knowledges within the curriculum and how transformative it could really be for pushing and pulling at how we understand economics, how we can understand international studies. And particularly with you, Dr. Parker, you're talking about how like it's not just funding. It's really like these high impact practices are really grounded in our understanding of relationships that are rooted and celebrating and supporting and also advancing the prosperity and longevity of indigenous peoples within this US empire. And so support doesn't always have to be just money. Yes, money helps a lot, but support can also really be these like small integration of things that we're asking for, but can make a big impact on our lives. Understanding how we can build those relationships. And it's so interesting we're talking about support because when when we look at the University of Denver's Native American Indigenous initiatives, two of the goals that DU says is that they're going to prioritize the healing of Native American and Indigenous students, staff, and faculty and ensure that they feel welcome, supported, and celebrated. And the other one is develop meaningful and reciprocal relationships with both the Denver and larger Colorado Native Indigenous community to further the healing and also increase equity. Yet, I wonder, what are some specific ways that you could just think of at the top of your head that can ensure that the University of Denver does just that? Based on your experiences and also based on like how you understand what it means to be a part of a Native community, to be part of your own Native community.
I can start. So I really think that it's extremely important for this university to make sure that they are allowing our voices to be heard. You know, many times we see that our students' and faculty's voices are just being like pushed under the rug a lot of times. And many of our voices, you know, we carry so many important just like experiences to share with the university. And often we see that the university often devalues our input. And so I think it's really important to create more initiatives that kind of surround the practice of being able to value and incorporate our feedback to the university overall.
Yeah, I think like actually implementing things that we're saying is important. Because I feel like a lot of the time I'm like speaking to people in admin and they'll just be like, okay, yeah, like you go do it for free for us. And also like, we're not gonna actually like implement anything that you do. Like we're gonna implement what we feel like is important and not necessarily like what is actually important to us. I also think that like being an Indigenous student here with like the pioneer moniker in general just makes me feel like a target all the time. Like if I do wear my indigeneity on my sleeve because I think that that's important and that I'm kind of like a teacher and I want to like be that person that can speak out in the community and, you know, like call out racism, which is very common here. But I think that like the whole pioneer thing just makes me always like look over my shoulder whenever I'm saying anything about anything, like literally like, the people here, right? So it's just very worrying to me that people can like actually be so okay with that enough to advocate for it to continue going on as they're like in classes with Indigenous students like us or like Indigenous professors. And so it's, yeah, I think that's something difficult.
I think the biggest thing for me and what I think is potentially really transformative of this space is that aspect that Charlie was highlighting about the reciprocal relationships with descendant communities or communities that are, you know, current residents of Colorado. So like, you know, the Denver Native community. And I think in particular, it's really important for DU to shift enough somehow to acknowledge that bringing, you know, for example, like these 4 Cheyenne singers who have literally spent their entire lives learning, you know, Cheyenne music, you know, one is a fluent Cheyenne speaker, it might not look the same as bringing, you know, Walter Manolo, right? So we're set up and we're used to what it looks like to bring academics to campus. And if we are really going to have a reciprocal relationship where we value and honor and respect Indigenous knowledge production, it's not going to look the same as it does currently, right? And so there needs to be sort of enough space in all of the systems from, you know, like the people who like are the accountants, to people who, you know, sort of sign off on checks, to recognizing that sometimes our community members might not have a bank account, right? I mean, there's sort of all of these layers that are both class and community and race, you know, sort of like based, that DU can be more accommodating about. And there's a lot of growth to sort of like be done in that area. But in particular, what I would like to see, I'd like us to have like a visiting elders program, with sort of like a priority to descendant communities. I think in particular, DU needs to do a lot better job of connecting with Ute communities in Colorado. I think there really hasn't been enough work to do that outreach, except for maybe by the Museum of Anthropology. And I think another thing that's just sort of on my mind, and that is kind of like, it's not a big deal, but it's just sort of like this grinding thing that kind of bugs me recently, is the whole mountain campus thing, right? And just how quickly DU made the decision to acquire this land. And now everybody's talking about like, oh, what can we do with this? What can we do? How is this going to benefit us? How is this going to benefit, you know, cause or the history department or the business school or whatever, right? And that to me is just like so backwards of how we should be thinking about this moment, right? So first of all, there should have been more of a focus, I think, on equity rather than efficiency in terms of like the time to sort of approve this and to think through what does this mean. Given that it's already done, right, and we don't have any say over it, I just strongly feel like every unit should instead be thinking about how can we make this meaningful for the original inhabitants of Colorado? How can we make programs and space for tribal communities in Colorado or that have been here historically? Because I mean, we got to be honest, like the entire state of Colorado is stolen. So, I mean, if you follow those ownership, you know, papers all the way back, there is some point, usually in the 1860s, when there was just some really shady stuff happening. And there was not just outright genocide, but, you know, questionable land acquisitions, executive orders to railroads, et cetera. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And so I just wish there could be a shift across campus in people's perspectives to think about not how is this going to benefit me or us, but how can we use this to make sure it benefits communities?
Mic drop. It's the end. I'm kidding. Yet a lot of you are, the thing is, what I like of this, particularly what I like about each of your responses, is that a lot of you sound like you're saying something different, but you're not. You're really addressing the crux of the issue here, is that the University of Denver does not, has not, and continues to not value the histories the ways of knowing, the ways of being of Native Indigenous peoples. I mean, Jaylee, you talked about how like your voice is basically being silenced by the University of Denver through these different initiatives and programs. And Panakwasa, you talked about how, particularly with the pioneer moniker, like the very presence, the very history of the pioneer is really rooted in this elimination and silencing and displacement and removal of Indigenous peoples. And Dr. Parker, you brought up so many contemporary issues that really, honestly, sounds like could be solved if the University of Denver simply values Native Indigenous peoples the same way it values tenured professors and academics and capitalism, if one could say that. And what I really like, so there was a question, there's a particular question from the audience, and I think something here that ties in with actually what we were talking about with the sort of Native American Indigenous initiative. So I just found out from this question that there are intentions to create a Native American and Indigenous Studies Center. And I wonder, maybe, how can I exactly frame this? In what ways would you tell those who are planning for the center, if you could say like one sentence, what is something you want them to focus on? And then in several sentences, what do you hope it could be part of with the larger university's plan to basically center and support Native Indigenous peoples? So it's like a two-part question. Essentially, what is some advice, I guess you could say, you have for the development of the center? And then what exactly do you have some advice on how that can connect to the University of Denver's initiatives? And if you don't have any advice, that's totally fine. I feel like a lot of you already gave enough.
I mean, I guess I could start with advice. I honestly feel like for me, my advice is always just go and actually talk to Ute and Cheyenne and Arapaho people and bring them together in community to talk. Because I feel like they always isolate, like, okay, we're going to talk to the Arapaho people this week and the Cheyenne this week. And if you could bring like everybody together to talk about this center and what it will mean for them and what they want to focus on as like the tribes that are originally from here, that would be a huge ask, but also just like a huge thing, because making people like part of it, and especially Indigenous people actually part of it, is really important. And I think like the center would mean a lot to like Indigenous people that don't feel like that feel isolated, right? Like maybe an Indigenous person in the Daniels School of Business could like come to the center and take classes in the center and focus on Indigenous issues there, where right now there's not really a space to do that. Like there's individual spaces, but every day going to a Native center would be so amazing, I feel like. So yeah, I guess that's my 2 cents.
I want to make space for Jaylee before I answer. I don't know if you have anything, but if you don't, that's fine.
Yeah, for sure. I was just thinking kind of, so I think it's really important, 2 aspects to kind of hit for this initiative is to make sure we're including history as well as empowerment. It's very important to also gather the resources that will make this, I guess, like cover the raw, true history of our ancestors, and everything around that. And like for the empowerment part, to kind of see how we can take this history and create a more empowering road, just like moving forward. And so I think like overall, this would be very beneficial for us because I feel like in general, this campus doesn't really have a space for us to go and feel like we are valued and feel like we have a place to feel like a piece of us exists on this campus. And so I think it's important to just kind of cover each of those aspects in terms of going forth with it.
So I am one of the people who's supposed to be working on a proposal for this Native American and Indigenous Studies Center, and I've probably been the least active member of our little cadre. I do want to just like let people know and give huge props to our provost, Mary Clark, because she's just like taken this and like really gone above and beyond despite like her incredibly taxing schedule to keep pushing this forward. And yeah, I have 2 new preps this quarter. That's my excuse. But I think the feedback is really important, you know, that Panakwasad and Jaylee just gave. I think you're absolutely right. And it's one of those moments where that community consultation and then that sort of like forward momentum really need to be embedded in this. I would say my biggest hope for the center is, like I said, to really be able to bring in Indigenous knowledge producers and people who are very well trained and who have sort of devoted their lives to studying this, who might not have like a PhD in the Western sense, but in the, you know, in their native communities, they are seen as sort of like the ultimate experts on whether it's like religion, language, you know, et cetera. I would love this center to have, you know, a strong commitment to really hosting the people like that well on campus to basically just sort of recognize, you know, that there are other forms of learning that are just as important and knowledgeable and deep as what we happen to do right in the academy.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. Thank you, Jaylee. And thank you so much, Panakwasat. Because, again, a lot of you are giving, okay, so this might just be me, but y'all are basically doing the job of proposing what the next initiatives that the University of Denver can take on. And I hope that people who are listening are really taking notes on that. Because this type of knowledge, it's not free, but we're giving it to y'all for free. And I think, so my last question, and I want us to think big. And for those listening, I want you to dream big with us as well. And I want you to share what changes are needed for the University of Denver for you to have more memorable experiences, hopefully more positive. Like if you had like the change makers, the people who are responsible for the budget, people who are responsible for the policies and practices of the University of Denver, if you were in a room with them, what would you tell them that needs to change, that needs to happen tomorrow, today, yesterday?
So I think overall, it would just be good to make this institution more inclusive towards our Indigenous community. I feel like a lot of the times, just for me personally, I feel like getting us here to the institution itself isn't the problem. It's whenever we're actually here, we tend to face many problems in terms of like lack of resources, in terms of funding, even as terms of like tutoring resources for academics, you know, all of that. And so I think there just needs to be more effort to kind of tend to our students who already exist on campus and just overall like make the transition more optimal for us and overall just make it more, I guess, tending to our indigeneity overall as students.
Oh, I would say so many things. I feel like I'd be in there for like a month probably, but I would say like the first thing would be school to higher education pipeline here. Like instead of, because on a lot of reservations, it's school to prison, school to poverty, like school to like whatever negative thing you could generally think about. And I feel like if we could create these pipelines, which we have plenty of like money to do this outreach, from reservations directly to here, finding ways to fund it, that is something that will be so like life-giving to Indigenous like groups in general, because they'll be able to have more people educated in their councils and be able to think critically even more about what they can do to protect themselves against, like, you know, colonizers. I also think reforming the education here is really important. Integrating Indigenous knowledge, Black knowledge, Latina knowledge, literally any form of knowledge you can think of that isn't white knowledge, is misrepresented here, or poorly, or not represented at all. And so putting funding into that, there's plenty of things you can do. Like you can pay students to go help people like professors do that, because we know we have the resources. We go and find it on our own because that's the only way we can learn in a good way here sometimes. And well, for me, the majority of the time at predominantly white institutions. So I think those are the two things that I would really stress, is like, how do we do this outreach and how do we reform our education so when Indigenous people get here, they feel included, but also feel like they can speak their mind about these issues like climate change, for example, right? I literally never get any climate resilience resources about Indigenous people, even though they're at the forefront of climate resilience and protect 80% of the biodiversity of the entire world. And so it's like, it really grosses me out, because I'm like, how are you not realizing this? And that Indigenous people are the water protectors and whatever. So I just think those are the two things that I would focus
on. So if I was the emperor, I would probably start by asking admissions to really focus on recruitment in descendant communities. I've seen a huge shift in the last 2 years from when there was like a relatively small Indigenous Native student group to now, when I think there's like around 30 or 40, right, who like consistently participate. And it makes, I mean, it's just like beautiful to see. It makes my life on campus as a faculty member like more fun. Like the other weekend we did like a cohort Olympics, right? And I like went, I think it was on a Friday. So it's kind of late, right, for me because I'm old. But I was like laughing the entire time just because, you know, everybody involved, and it was just amazing to see. And that's like that sort of like moment of community on campus where I'm like, man, I'm so thankful for Stevie Lee and for Chris and for all of, you know, our staff members like Alicia Lucero in business, right, who come together and we all sort of co-create this community with the students. So I mean, I would like to see more students on campus. And I think in particular, like our institution really needs to like focus and dedicate itself to recruitment in Ute communities at Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, at Northern Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho. Those need to be sort of like the places we start. And I think that needs to look like people actually going out to high schools on the res, going to Indian education in Denver and building those relationships. And it takes time, right? It takes time and resources. I think the second thing would be in the financial aid system. it can be really difficult for students, especially first gen students, to navigate financial aid and to even know like, oh, okay, this is what work study is. I shouldn't decline it because I'm not going to get this, sort of compensation rate necessarily off campus, right? And so to have like a more hands-on approach, and that's not just for Native students, but really across the board, specifically for first gen students, I think that would be super important, like making sure students know what's going on, and also having a process where students aren't penalized if their family situation doesn't look like the typical DU student. And so that might be, people who aren't living with their parents, right? Whose parents aren't supporting them, who might have a huge amount of issue getting their parents' tax returns, right? I just feel like financial aid oftentimes is like this big sort of black hole of emotional energy that students have to navigate. And even as well-intentioned as I know the financial aid office is, I think the system could be structured in ways that is more supportive to all first gen students. I think the other thing I would say is we need to have leadership empowered who are focused on transparency and communication and true reciprocity. Unfortunately, in my first 2 years here, I really felt as though the Native the Native faculty group has been sort of like Sisyphus, like pushing this boulder up a hill that just sort of like rolls back down, because oftentimes the siloed nature of the administration at DU leads to a complete lack of transparency and communication. And sometimes individuals have been empowered who are more acting in the role of like an obstacle or sort of like a roadblock, as opposed to, hey, guess what? We have all of these tribal leaders coming to campus. We need to make sure all of the faculty and the students know that they're going to be here so that we can host them well, and so that we can really show our respect to these people who are coming for this consultation or for this, issue. And unfortunately, a lot of times we only hear about it like a few days before, if we even hear about it at all. And I think, that's a big issue. The last thing I would say, particularly around like leadership at DU, is there needs to be trust that your faculty and staff are competent, that we know what we're talking about, that we've actually studied for many, many years to be able to be in these positions. And so doing things like checking up on classroom management, or interrogating somebody about, well, why are these the people that you want to bring to campus? All of those are really sort of subtle ways of undercutting our expertise. And so I would just say, have the assumption that you would have towards, any cis male, white professor who wants to bring in a thought leader on a certain issue. Trust that they know what they're talking about. Trust that what they're requesting from you is actually something that might be innovative, interesting, valuable to the DU community. And trust that, as I said before, we're competent. Unfortunately, there's an atmosphere, and this isn't just at DU, this is across the country, where women of color in particular are presumed to be incompetent. And that presumption of incompetence also extends usually to men of color, or, people from any sort of gender identity, right, of color. And so it would be really great to be able to do my job and not feel as though I'm having somebody, sort of looking over my shoulder and micromanaging. I'd like it to be more like a yes and relationship. Like, hey, that's a great idea. Let's think about how we can do this, as opposed to, I don't think we can do that. Why do you want to do this again? So those would be my suggestions.
Great. I had like this whole, anyway, thank you everyone. I hate meeting. I hate the Zoom feature anymore. But again, thank you, Jaylee. Thank you, Panekwasa. Thank you, Dr. Parker, for sharing your insight, your vision, your dreams. But also thank you for sharing what the University of Denver needs to do and being vulnerable and honest with us. I really hope people take in that what you have shared is a gift that I hope others accept and celebrate and like. Thank you everyone for coming in, and thank you again to Chase and to the community and values team as well. Chase, now it's back to you.
Yeah, no, there is nothing that I can add that would help this talk because it was phenomenal. Thank you so much. We truly were honored to create this space in partnership with Heritage Months and so many folks. A special shout out to IT, who always helps us put on these events, and Clara for pulling it together in partnership with so many. Thank you so much. We wanted to let folks know that we hope you do well in finals, that you enjoy a much needed restful break. And we will pick up our community talks again in the winter and spring quarters, along with our community wellness hours for snacks for the community, free drinks for the community. You'll see Community Plus Values graduate fellows handing out DU merchandise to folks. And so we're trying to create that community one day at a time. And it starts with conversations like these. And we know it's not easy to be in this space, but thank you truly for sharing this. We were honored to create this, and we hope everybody has a good break and gets some rest. Thank you so much.